Hi guys, welcome to another episode of CodeFilms. I was in this code film, I want to look at fixes. I was working on this piece of code which I found online around Java JSP technologies. This one is a quick one. It's not the normal code films. Something that I think needs to be addressed. And I realized that I had this issue with naming context when I was using Java JNDI. So actually, I spent close to like the whole day of Saturday trying to solve this problem. It took me a lot of days. I really struggled with it. I really struggled, but I didn't give up. I just kept on pushing. So for this one, I'm going to create a new workspace just to address this issue. So I'll call this workspace uh, ground. Let's say just play workspace. And let's select that folder. Yeah, so back to what I was saying. So the error was in such a way that I tried searching for information online, trying to understand name referencing JDI. In other words, it couldn't perform a lookup uh, when you try to connect to the database. So that stress alone taught me a whole lot of things about Java technologies, and then the exception was throwing. So in this code, we want us to look at how to sometimes push, not to give up, but just to push to find what you want, and how sometimes planning and laying out your thoughts on paper or even on sticky notes helps to resolve such issues. I did a lot of writing, like I did a lot of writing. So JNDI, the version, that's which Java version was used to build the application, context, lookup, portability, the Java build path, Java version, Eclipse IDE, the traditional class part, the module part. All these things played a role in helping me to appreciate the error that I was encountering. So if you go through my history, you realize that I've spent quite a lot of time trying to resolve this issue. So I'll just show you from where it started from. So if you look in between my searches, you can actually see some JNDI issue. So it starts from here. Failed to retrieve JNDI. This is the error. Let's just open this in a new tab. I'll trigger it with Apache, but I just want to show you something. So this is the error I was getting. So I says failed to retrieve JNDI naming context for the container. And it continues Catalina, blah 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 blah, an ugly stack trace. So no cleanup was performed. So and it goes no naming context bound to this class loader. So the catch that really helped me later on to resolve the issue was understanding what class loader was. To be honest with you, if that hadn't come out with laying out of my like the little keywords I was picking, versions, class path, build path, all these things wouldn't have contributed to the success of resolving the issue. But because of continuous um, perseverance and determination, I was able to come out without giving up. So you can look through my searches every time stamp trying to solve the issue, just trying to solve the issue, because every issue can be solved. Sometimes you got to listen to music just to kill down the stress in the brain, so it keeps going, naming sessions, common problems, JNDI tutorials. So you gotta dissect the problem and break it down into models. That's the only way you can really solve this problem. So you can see that was yesterday, Saturday, as of 11:52 p.m. Still on it, still on it, still on it, still on it. 1:52 a.m. all the way to Sunday. So it was actually today that the issue was resolved. So it was around 2 a.m. So let's just go right down to that issue. Enough of the talk. You can see that I have a lot of tabs open already just to understand. So I was even considering of purchasing a course for Eclipse, but it wasn't worth the money. and reading all this technical documentation, look up an object. Yeah. But hey, the issue has been resolved, so let's just get right to it. Alright, so in this workspace, I want us to first of all import the code that caused the whole problem, or that rose, or that gave us that problem. So first of all, directory, downloads, and we have a projects folder. This one was cloned online from Cave of Programming via Udemy. I really want to go by this. Let's look at the downloads first to appreciate. Alright, so we have this zip file, and then we want to use their database source code to perform some SQL queries. So let's extract this to the desktop. Alright, and let's import that from Eclipse. So this is what we are going to import. Look at the timestamp. It's today's date. It has to be today's date. So let's go back again. Let me confirm. We have only one database. Please come in. Alright, so is this, let's import it again. So let's extract the file again. Projects, database. So let me just drag and drop it here. Get back to the later. Okay, so we know that this is what we're going to work on. Let's go back. Open projects from file system, directory, desktop. Yeah, this is it. That was the date it was prepared. Sorry. Alright, so we realize that during the importing stages, there are some things you don't need, like search for nested project. You just need to detect and configure the project natures. That one is a little bit technical, referring to build path and class path, but let's leave that for another day. It's another headache. But you don't need to search for nested project because the project is not nested to any other project. But you can just import it just this way, and it will pop up. Alright, so already we are getting some errors. We're encountering some errors with regards to, so it starts with, first error you encounter has to do with the build path. There's a build path error that's trying to make reference to certain drivers that you need to run your program and an unbound class path. And you also have a target runtime Apache that is not defined. So these are the two major errors that will not cause this code to work. So if you try to run this program just by running your controller, just to confirm one or two issues, you can't even run your controller because you don't have the libraries to execute your commands. See, you have no server defined. All these things have to be done before. So let's tackle it one by one. So first step, properties, then we move to Java build path, because this has something to do with the JNDI. If you visit our sticky notes, you will realize that it has something to do with our JNDI. So build path has something to do with trying to get this thing to work. So this come to libraries, and these are the libraries that are already existing, but we are not going to use a MySQL connector Java 5 because we are using Java 14 and Apache Tomcat 9. So we need to even change that configuration first. So first things is specify our Java version. Once our Java version is specified, you realize that it will automatically create a class path and model path system for you. That's because it's Java 9. Java 14 is something that's being supported in Java 14. Right, so let's go back to our Java build path. Realize that we have our model path and our class path. These are two key vital path systems that you need to have, because when Java decides, or when your compiler decides to run your program and Java cannot find your class path, it's going to be a big issue. So you get that error as usual, no class path could be found. So you have to make that configuration. So the next one is going to, we want to change the GRE you are using, because we are working. You can work with this GRE, you can work with this Java 14, but we have to change our Tomcat server that we are using. We don't have Tomcat 8, and then from the documentation, Tomcat 8 has reached end of life. So you have to upgrade or move higher. Somewhere in the documentation it talks about Tomcat 8 reaching end of life. Let's just Google it. So the team announced that it will end on 30th June 2018. So you have to move higher. Yep. So we have to target something higher. So we come back to our project facets, and we'll come to our runtimes, and we're going to create a new runtime environment, and that will be Apache Tomcat 9. So this is what we are going to work with. And we'll browse for the directory of that. Coding is enjoyable, but sometimes it's very stressful, especially with Java. Realize that Java is very neat. It's quite easy to learn, but coding it is a different thing. It's quite slow. You can understand, but just to write one line of code, you have to think several times just to come up with the right instruction. Alright, so you realize that when we did that, we resolved the squiggly lines. That was with regards to the data types we're using, or the objects that we're using, the classes. But there's still one thing, that's the driver. Since we are not using, since Java 8 has reached end of life, we can no longer use this driver. We're going to delete it from our project properties configuration. I just try my best to let all these technical things be appreciated as much as possible. Apply. Using Java 14. We deleted that. So Java build path. Let's change this one to as well to Java. Let's make it Java 14. Well, it is. So we're using Java 14 now. Apply. So you realize that all our errors have now disappeared. All these are just deprecated values. Okay, so now let's test our piece of code. So right now we are not supposed to have issue with class path variables, as we explained the other time. So as we explained earlier in the video with class per variables. Oh yeah, there's an invalid port. Sorry, let me just change the port number to 0. It's yeah, the thing is 1. It's supposed to be 0. Start from 0. Okay. Save this. Okay, so let's run our code again. Next, finish. Okay, so our piece of code is working. As simple as that. Our piece of code is working. So the error has been solved. But sometimes it gets very tricky, and this is how tricky it can get. Let's try and run this piece of code, the data source.demo. You realize that it's still going to make reference to this controller. Let's stop the application because it needs other properties to make this things work successfully. What made this one work successfully was when you look into our Work.xml file, we have this JDBC lookup that is being done by a resource. Sorry, open with yeah. So there are times that when it's performing a JDBC lookup, if there are two ways that it performs this lookup, either using this resource reference, or you have to specify the same thing inside your context.xml, and that context.xml too is another way of making sure that you are connecting to the database. There are two ways of doing this. I'll pull up the documentation to make things clear. So if you look into the documentation, oh, it's becoming unbearable. I should do another search. Let's check through our files here, our history. Context. I can't seem to locate. Let me just perform a quick search. Yeah, so sorry, this was it. Oh, yeah. So there are two ways. The following elements may be used in web application descriptors of your web application to define resource. That's using the Web.xml. So it goes on to say that if Tomcat is unable to identify the appropriate resource factory or additional configuration information is required, additional Tomcat specific configuration must be specified before Tomcat can create the resource. Tomcat specific resources entered in context elements that can be specified either in this or preferably in the Context.xml. So it says that where the same resource name has been defined, blah blah blah, included in the web application blah 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 .xml and in an blah 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 blah, the values will take precedence. So this is what I want you to take, that for the the values in the deployment descriptor will take precedence only if allowed by the corresponding environment by setting the override attribute to true. So what it's trying to say is that there are two ways of providing your resource factory. So provided that Tomcat is able to identify an appropriate resource factory to use to create the resource, that no further configuration information is required. Tomcat will use the information to create the resource. So realize that we didn't specify anything in our Web.xml, in our Context.xml, just in our Web.xml. So we have avoided that error. But look at this. Let's have a look at another piece of code. This one will throw a different error. Okay, so this one is working as well. All right. No, so this is the best way to diagnose it. Let's have a system out here. And let's say that init method data source demo. Let's see init method inside data source demo. So diagnose. Let's do this so we know where we are calling our function from. So let's stop the server first. Stop the server. Run on the server. And so you can see it's not reading from the right folder. That's because we have defined the method is supposed to call here, but because in our Web.xml to deployment descriptors we haven't done a servlet mapping for the data source servlet, is calling or returning the default servlet, which is this mapping that has been done. So we realize that if we go into the controller and we also put our diagnostic tool over there, it's still calling the same, still calling the same method. So init method inside controller diagnose. Let's stop the server again. Let's clean our Tomcat. Sometimes Eclipse can cache the data gets cached inside the Tomcat Apache server. We want to avoid that. There's always supposed to be a fresh run. It shouldn't be cached in memory. So we've done the cleaning, we've saved our changes, we've stopped our server as well too. Let's clean our terminal. Let's run the piece of code again from the data source.demo. So you see it's calling the inside the controller method, which is wrong because of the servlet mapping that has been done in the Web.xml. The Web.xml is more of your scaffolding for all your servlet mapping, deployment descriptors. So let's just copy the same thing and let's paste it down here, and let's change this one to demo.data source, and let's make the URL data source. let's save this. Forget about the spelling. So we see these changes. Let's stop our server. Let's run it again. Let's clear the cache inside the server. Let's just make sure that everything is clean. We have no old code running in the server. They ain't stuck in our server. So let's run it again. Let's see. Still inside the controller method. This servlet mapping is quite vague. Let's make it a little bit more descriptive. Let's have the servlet. Let's go online and get those pieces of information. Let's copy everything here, the name and the mapping. So servlet mapping controls how you access a servlet. A set of servlet configuration and mappings from the web is followed by a table. So it shows the URL used to invoke this servlet. So let's work with that one. Okay, so let's refactor this. Format it. Alright, so the servlet name is data source. How do we know that this is a servlet name? You can check from here. So data source is the name of the servlet. That's the name of the Java file. So, oops, sorry. So data source. What's the servlet class? So servlet class is demo.data source demo. Then what's the servlet name again? So you define the servlet. Now the servlet name is the demo. And how do we want to access this? Backslash data source. So let's do away with this instance. Alright, so let's give it another run. Delete from our server. Clear our cache. So good. So we are inside our init method inside our data source because we've explicitly defined our data source servlet. So you see that you cannot create JDBC driver file because our connection is null. So it's throwing an SQL exception. No suitable driver. So remember that the first time we wrote the first when we run this code with controller.java, it worked perfectly without the driver. And then remember that we read from the documentation that if there is no explicit definition to our resource, sometimes it does go into our context.xml. But if we are to run this context.xml, so that's what we are going to do now. We are going to infuse this second kind of backup, or a second code, like a name server or a second dependency on our in our context.xml. This one will definitely work without a doubt. It works. So we are inside our controller method, fine, because it's making reference to our JDBC connection here. And it's working. It's working perfectly. Like, it's working perfectly with this. But when you come to data source demo, almost like the same piece of code, it's throwing an exception. That's the SQL exception is throwing. It cannot connect to it. There's no connection. You can't get a connection. The connection is null. And controller.java. We're not really using a connection here, so it's not throwing an exception. What is there? Is any connection generated? No connection has really been initiated. We are just trying to create. Let's look at it again. We are just trying to create. Try to log into application. So no connection has been created. The connection will only be created when we do pass in our emails and our passwords. We can look at that one later, but now let's try and solve this issue. So what are we going to do? We are going to go into our context.xml and define that driver dependency, that the driver, there's no driver and the connection is null because we can't establish a connection. So let's I have them already on a notepad. So the notepad is going to serve as our guide. Yes, here. That explicit connection. So just copy. This one can be found on the Apache Tomcat page on how to use insert into context.xml. So you realize that once this is saved and we stop our server as usual, make it spanking clean. It's a machine, it's a computer. Computers need humans to also operate. That's why we have artificial intelligence to make computers think. By the moment we're still getting there, we are even there thanks to Elon Musk and other creative people that are pushing boundaries, especially with this neural link thing of playing games with your mind. Crazy stuff. Okay, so clean. Let's run it again. This time around, you realize that we ain't gonna get that error. Voila, connected to what? Database. So that's the video. The video is all about how to make your JNDI work. Even when you got the code, or you clone the code from another server, from someone else's machine to perform your work, you still have to set the class path. That's the first thing. Set the class path, the build path. You have to make sure that you set it up, or you perform that scaffolding for the compiler to be able to understand where do I find my class files to prepare the bytecode now for the JVM to be able to execute this bytecode and run on your machine. That has to be done. If that's not done, they can't find your class loader. The error that I showed you about no class loader was found. Yeah. So then now the next one is um, how let's disprove the thought also with the controller. So the controller was able to present the page without redefining any property inside our any resource inside our context.xml, but we just have it in our web.xml, and they are saying that with just this it should be sufficient enough to perform querying. Now let's go into our database, MySQL database. Let's search for the usernames that have already been set there and try and log in with that and confirm if we can still log in with just the web.xml. Sorry if it's not going as quickly as I want, but this is a quickie. This is not this is not a pure code film. It's something that I really encountered that I think had to be addressed as soon as possible. Alright, so it's web shop. So let's query our web shop to find any users inside our web shop. So we have that's because he's the author I'm learning from. JNDI of programming. So let's use that piece of information to perform our work. So we are going to execute without a resource artifact inside our context.xml. Let's run this on the server for controller.java. I think we should have stopped the server before. So we are inside data source. No, we don't want to inside data source. Okay, now we are inside controller. So why are we now? Are we in data source or in controller? That's why we have to clean our cache. Let's terminate. Let's remove everything. Let's clean Tomcat work directory. Let it just be an infant code. Let's run it again. And now let's also add this piece of code just in case it throws an exception in our controller. Let's try and find what the exception is. So sysout exception generated is exception generated. So e.get explanation, explain exception. Let's look into that. Right, so we're all clean. Let's another spin. We've saved our file. So we're inside our controller. So that's right, we're inside our controller. So let's log in. Rather, we have our details here. And let's confirm our thoughts on not having a resource artifact in our context.xml. Printed our password. No, let's enter our password. We printed our email. Let's enter our password. So let me in here. Let's see what happens. Unable to connect to what database. So it goes on to tell you that the web.xml, because we don't have our definition inside our context.xml, unable to connect to database. So let's even go into our controller and see where do we get that. Why are we getting that error? This one we are logging in, so it's a post. Unable to connect to. Let's even find out what the error is. We are posting to our database. We are not getting, so we are posting. So SQL exception. e.get message or get course. let's get course. So explain exception. Let's stop our server. Let's clean the Tomcat of any caching that can be done. Let's run it again. Okay, let's log in. Let's come. Let me. So good. This is no suitable what driver. No suitable driver. No suitable driver. So this is a good exception message. So that goes on to say that our JNDI lookup was performed successfully. That's a good thing, because if JNDI wasn't performed successfully, this we wouldn't have gotten to this point, because that's being done at our first entry point during our initialization. So you see, so our JNDI lookup was done successfully. So there is no issue here. We only get an issue here when we come here and then let's say I change the database I want to access. Here I'll get a JNDI issue. So the JNDI lookup issue we're having initially, as I explained that I couldn't sleep and others, was because of class path and model path configuration and that kind of referencing. So if we run this now, as usual, please clear your cache. It gets frustrating, but it's a computers are dumb. The software works with computers to make them intelligent, so you may never know what will be predicted. You can get cache, so you just do your part. And on the server, this time around we're going to get a JNDI issue. Yeah, so a servlet exception is being generated. So, and that servlet exception is because we are unable to find what web shop exception generated. Web shop is not bound in this context, unable to find what web shop. So this is one issue we are having, and that issue maps to what caused the sleepless night. The sleepless night that we've made mention about, the JNDI naming exception. Yep, something around this line. Yeah, the messages are full of around the naming exception that's being generated. So yeah, in other words, that proves that lookup wasn't performed. We couldn't look up our object because it says you couldn't map our JNDBC with. It's not bound in this context. Unable to find blah 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 blah. Yeah, so that kind of a thing. So when we resolve this now by removing this, you save it. This exception will go when you come to your Context.xml, and then you copy and paste this resource artifact. That also helps to log into your file, your database. So you see that when lookup fails, you can't even load your page. If lookup works, you can load your page. Now with this also working, you can log into your database. So now let's, as usual, stop your server, delete it from the server, remove it from the server, refresh run, clean your Tomcat work directory, spink and span, run on the server, next, finish. Now our folder will pop up nicely, connected to database. because it already has in memory some data source that we already configured. So it has already been cached. That's the word. So let's try and get a fresh one again. Even it has already been cached. Remember, we had that state already. Clean. To be clean. Or better still, let me just delete this server and implement a new one. So create a new server. Finish. Now let's load our file again. Okay. Alright, so let's give it another spin. Invalid port, sorry. Let's undo that. Wow, so realize that we have no caching issue here. So now let's log in. John. Voila. So it's working. So yeah, so in summary, in summary, context.xml needs drivers to connect to avoid SQL exception, and then Web.xml needs say naming exception must be avoided by setting up your class path and runtime environment setup such that lookup can be performed. That's the keyword. Lookup can be performed. Can be performed. Yeah. If you don't set those things up right, you realize that you can't even run your code. That's why we need a Java build path settings and project assets to do this work. So we realize that when we got the code initially, it made aware of some connector driver not being able to work. And if you try running the code, it's not going to work. So if you want to avoid a naming exception, you have to make sure that you set up you go into your Java build path and perform your necessary scaffolding. So it knows the Java version is working with and the runtime environment it has to work with. So it can perform a lookup even if you have the resource inside your Web.xml and it throws the exception. You know that lookup is being performed and it's not successful because it can't find the JNDBC or the naming context, and that's because you changed the name. I don't know if you guys get this stuff, but it's that the issue has been resolved. As I said, the issue has been resolved, but it's quite technical and it needs you need to spend a lot of time on it. But it has been resolved and it's working. It's something that is working. So no naming context bound to this class loader has been resolved. And we've solved it. Yeah, it has been solved. So yeah, we went into our Web.xml, did everything we need to do. So no naming context bound to this class loader. So we set up our class path to do that work, and voila, it's working. So it's working. That's what I can say. It's working now. So instead of saying fail to retrieve JNDI naming context for container, so no cleanup, we're able to retrieve that because we set up our class files right for the binding to be able to do work. And in our Web.xml too, we make sure that we use the right JDBC that maps to the object that maps to the name of the database we want to look at. When we change the name, it controls that exception as well. When we look at the context.xml, that if you don't have a context.xml, it will try an SQL exception. So you may have a web.xml which will help you to start your file, but it will throw a naming exception. It may not even throw a naming exception based on what you have in your resource. But if you want to go into your database, you need to have the driver. So we have the driver exception also being thrown. And with a little bit of perseverance, as I said earlier, the issue has been resolved. It has been resolved. So all the sleepless night from yesterday, from around 1 p.m., 11:52 p.m., just trying to all the way to 2 a.m., just trying to solve this problem has been resolved. So when you want to work with such, when you want to fix anything, always try and break into models. You can start with the language. I think this has to go on paper. You break it down, the version, the context, the lookup, portability, Java build part, Java version, the IDE itself, class part, and the model part. You just break it down, and with a little bit of research and persistence, you get what you want. So that's it for this CodeFilms. It's a quick one. There's something like freestyle, but more than a freestyle. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, as usual, like, comment, whatever. Bye.